G'day everyone, DJ DARQs here. This is a presentation on 2DX setups, which I've been meaning to do for a long time. Now, obviously we're not on the couch, we're on the floor just because I'm a bit lazy today, but this is basically just going to cover what you should be doing or what you should be looking at in order to get an arcade style setup in your controller, because I know a lot of people have asked about this. So let's get going, shall we? First and foremost, I want to say that setups really don't matter that much until you get to endgame. And endgame, I mean, is like level 11 plus. Before that, like, it really doesn't matter which kind of setup you're playing on. I mean, I know there's people who've played on cherry switches all the way through to 12s and it's been okay. But it's an optimization which is only really relevant once you pass level 11. Now, I will be using the Japanese standard from the arcades as a reference, and I'm not saying it's the absolute correct thing, but it's what we're going to be using as a reference point for this video. So obviously at the end I'll bring in subjective factors, but this is what I'm focusing on. Finally, the other thing is I'm only looking at points which can be directly measured and directly attributed. Like, I don't know about button resistance, so yeah, with those points in mind, let's get stuck into it. Right, so as you know, Japan's had Beatmania for 14 years now, and you know, the machines have gone through many different revolutions. Like, they've changed a lot over time, and obviously with that, the keys and the setups within the machines have changed. So what does a typical Japanese arcade use in their setups? It's a question that a lot of people have asked, and a lot of people, you know the answer to this, but I just wanted to highlight a very significant point. The first is there's actually two different arcade setups that Japan has, which they've changed over time. So my head's going to be in the way of this, but that should say pre-2DX 12. Now, pre-2DX 12, what they had were these old sort of generation Sanwas, and inside them they were using 100 gram springs and 100 gram Omron microswitches. So the picture on the side is of a relatively old machine. It looks like it's from 2003. So 2003 would have been, you know, like a 9th style, 10th style arcade. And yeah, like that, those are the keys which you see very commonly in the machines in America, in Australia, places where you would have received older cabinets, because it would have had this old generation setup of old gen setup with springs and microswitches. However, past 12th style, past Happy Sky, you start to notice this setup starting. And this is the new generation setup, as we know them today as new generation Sanwas. These setups by default have 100 gram springs and 50 gram microswitches inside them. So they've obviously made it a bit lighter because they realized around 2DX 12 that the difficulty was ramping up, and you know, with the heavier keys it was more difficult to my laptop's running out of battery. Sorry, just give me a second here. They realized that as the game was getting more difficult, that they needed to start making the keys a little bit lighter, because the patterns were getting to the point where, you know, pressing down on the really hard switches was taking a toll. It was making people more tired. So clearly they decided, alright, we're going to make the standard a little bit lighter so that those harder songs are easier. So yeah, sorry about the power source notification in the middle there. So that's the difference in the setups over the years. So it progressed from old generation 100 gram microswitches to the current 50 gram microswitches and new generation Sanwas. Now, obviously, there's two generations of Sanwas, and you think, okay, so what's the difference? And you only really notice the difference if you're actively playing between the two of the setups. Old generation Sanwas are a lot softer. Now, what I mean by softer is their actuation point, which is covered by my head. Actuation point is the point in which the key actually registers. The actuation point is less noticeable. So it's kind of like cushioned. It's like pushing down on a pillow as opposed to just hitting a table. So, you know, you get a cushioned effect off the old generation Sanwa buttons, which you don't get off the new generation ones. So the new generation ones are a bit crisper. Like, they have a nice crisp sound to them when you press, the actuation point is very clear when you hit the button. Whereas with the old generation ones, it feels a lot softer and a lot more cushioned. So that's the main difference. I mean, other than that, they're both very similar. It's just the older generation ones are clearly more worn looking because they've been in the machines for over a decade. So that's the Sanwa difference. Let's move on now to DAO differences. Now, I know that a lot of people ask, what's the difference between DAO keys and what's the difference between Sanwa keys? Now, right here in my hand, I've got both a Sanwa key and a DAO key. Okay, so when I talk about the differences, I can actually show you on the webcam at the same time. Now, DAO keys have a shorter actuation point, so the button actually sits up a little bit lower than a Sanwa key does. Okay, so the DAO key takes less time to press down than the Sanwa key does. Okay, and also they're generally quite easy to maintain. I've noticed pulling apart DAO keys is really easy, whereas pulling apart Sanwas takes a little bit more force. Like with the DAO key, you can just twist the microswitch holder out, whereas with the DAO key, you've literally got to like shove it in and rip it out every time you want to make a change. So a little bit easier to maintain and shorter actuation point. The Sanwa buttons are a little bit higher than the DAO keys. Okay, as you can see here, if I put them side by side, you can only just notice it, but the Sanwa keys are a bit flatter, I think, than the DAO keys, and they do sit a little bit higher. Now, the main difference between them is the sound, and I'll try and capture this. I don't know if it'll come through, but if I hit the DAO key, and then you hit the Sanwa key, there's like a tone shift when you hit the two. Like, the tone will come down a little bit with the Sanwa key. And the Sanwa key's sound is a lot deeper, I've found, especially with the feedback. So when you let go of the DAO key, you get a very sudden click up, whereas with the DAO key, it's a lot more prolonged. So you get more of a feedback from hitting down the Sanwa button as opposed to DAO buttons. And as I said before, they're just a little bit more difficult to pull apart. But other than that, you know, there's not a huge difference between the two. They look very similar, but the main difference is in the sound and the feel. So when it comes down to it, you know, Sanwas feel a lot nicer to press. When I changed to Sanwas this week, I was very, very happy. I thought, this is great. They feel fantastic. You know, the sound that you get off them is unreal. Like, it's just like the arcade. So they're definitely much more comfortable to play on than DAO keys. So if you have the money and you want the best possible like setup, I would definitely say get the Sanwa keys. They're beautiful. They're absolutely amazing. However, they are a luxury item. Okay, just because you have DAO keys doesn't mean that you're going to play better. What it does is it just gives you a nicer feeling controller. Playing on DAO keys is absolutely fine. I mean, the top ranking players on Program Sun at the moment are all playing on DAO keys, and they have no issues. And you know, players like Krellian have played on both setups, and they said, yeah, it's noticeably different, but it's not, you know, going to hinder your play. The keys don't really contribute much to the overall playability of a controller. The thing which really, really matters for playability is resistance, which is cut off by my massive head. I really should make that smaller. So, what is resistance? Well, obviously, you know, resistance is the amount of force required to press down the key and register a button press. Now, obviously, the more resistance you have, the more difficult it is to hit the key. The less resistance you have, the easier it is to hit the key. So you'd probably think by that logic, well, why don't I just make it as light as possible so that it's really easy to hit the key? Well, if you do that, I mean, yes, it is easy to hit the key, but what happens is you lose feedback. Now, what is feedback? Obviously, the awareness of when a button is released is what feedback is. So when you lift off, the button will spring up a little bit, and that's dependent on, you know, your springs and your microswitches. But a degree of feedback is almost necessary for the game. You need feedback in order to know when you're letting go of keys. And it's really important, as I said, for higher levels, especially with things like jacks, because if you don't get feedback for jacks, it's really difficult to do them. Okay? So what factors in for resistance? You know, what actually brings that resistance to the keys and the controller? Well, The things which attribute to it, as I've shown in this nice diagram here with the button completely pulled apart, is only 3 parts. It's the button type itself. So for example, if we're using a DAO button or a Sanwa button, it adds a little bit, but the main attributing factors are the springs, which you can see in between the 2 key parts there, and the microswitch itself, which is on the far end of that picture. So the main things which contribute are the button type, spring, and microswitches. However, the majority of it falls on the springs and the microswitches. So if you had a hierarchy and you had to say, okay, what is the most important thing for my setup? It would go on this order. So you'd have microswitches first. That's the first thing you'd want to replace. Then you'd want to look at your springs and then the buttons. So as I said in this PowerPoint, microswitches and springs factor in for most of it. You don't really want to focus on buttons, and it's a mistake which an arcade in my area made, where they thought that the machine was dying because the buttons were bad, when in fact their microswitches were over 20 years old. So they replaced all of the buttons, and then the machine was still terrible, and they didn't understand what the problem was. So in the end, always focus on the microswitches first. Don't go for buttons. It's always microswitches, then springs, then buttons. So follow that hierarchy and you should be okay. Now, microswitch types. Let's talk about microswitches very quickly. There are tons of different microswitches that you can choose from. And as you can see from the picture there, I've only got 2 types at the moment. But the common ones which you see in controllers and arcades, well, not so much arcades for the first one, are Honeywells, which are 15 gram microswitches. Then you've got your Omron 25 gram, 50 gram, and 100 gram switches. And if an arcade's getting desperate, which I see a lot in Australia doing, they occasionally put in cherry microswitches. And cherry microswitches are 200 grams. So they're massive. Like, you wouldn't want to use cherries in most situations, but arcade owners resort to using them because they run out of resources. You know, they don't have Omron switches on hand. So you see a lot of cherries coming through, unfortunately. But that's usually what you'd see or what you deal with. Comparing microswitches, Honeywells are far too soft. Far too soft. Like, you'll find that most Honeywells will sort of die on you very quickly, I find. And they just don't have a nice feel. They don't offer much feedback. Cherry switches are far too heavy. They're 200 grams resistance alone, which is just massive. So cherry switches are like absolutely out of the question if you're looking for an ideal setup. So I'm axing those off the list. I wouldn't recommend those 2. What I'll be focusing on today is primarily Omron switches, in particular 50 and 100 grams. So, springs. What kind of springs are there? Now, the picture in this slide is of a DAO and Sanwa spring. And I haven't got them sitting side by side, but the DAO springs are a little bit shorter than the Sanwa springs. And when I compared them to a 100 gram spring, they were both offering about the same amount of resistance, you know, plus minus about 20. So, as I said in this, the default springs are about 80 to 100 grams resistance, which is the ideal range, where you'd want them to be, I'm guessing. So, other springs that you can get are 25 gram, which are very light springs, and I've heard there's 50 grams. I haven't found them online, but you can get 50 gram springs somewhere, which I'd like to find out if anyone knows. So springless setups, obviously this is another option which a lot of people tend to go to in America, and that is to just remove the spring entirely from the button. And what that does is it relies entirely on the resistance of the microswitch. So if you remove the spring and you put it in, the button itself will just rest on top of the microswitch, and it means that all of the resulting feedback and resistance comes from the microswitch. So what that actually does is it stops the cushioning effect from the button. So if you've got a default cushioning effect, that'll be removed. And what that actually does is it makes the clicking sound louder, because you haven't got that extra sort of cushioned resistance to stop the click. So it makes the clicks louder, it reduces the feedback and the resistance. So a lot of people opt for this option. But what is ideal? Like, you know, we've got all of these different setups. What would we say is the ideal thing? Now, if you're aiming to replicate, you know, the Japanese arcades, which I play in, there's a simple rule, and that is just make sure that your resistance is in between the range of 100 grams and 150 grams. That is the standard for Japanese arcades, and that is basically what I see as ideal. It gives like the perfect zone of like resistance and feedback. If you go any lower, you risk losing feedback. If you go any higher, you risk gaining too much resistance. So that window, 100 grams and 150 grams additional resistance, is where you'd want your setup to be. Now I'm just going to cover some setups really quickly before I wrap this up. So we've got 150 grams, 100 microswitches, so blah 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 blah. 50 gram microswitches, 100 gram springs. So this is the standard, as I said at the start of the video. This is what most people use in their arcades. Now, it's been stated by Japanese reviewers who've come to Nova Station and played on the Nova machine, which is where I play, that the keys there are perfect. They're not too soft, they're not too hard, they offer the perfect amount. So, with that in mind, I actually asked the person who looks after the machines, what is your setup? And this is the setup that he told me he was running. 50 gram microswitches, 100 gram springs. So, this is basically perfect. I mean, obviously you could run maybe a 50 gram spring as well, and you'd still be okay, but I find this is what I'm running in my controller at the moment, and it feels fantastic. It just gives the perfect amount of both. It gives both the right amount of resistance, it gives the right amount of feedback. So I would highly recommend this in setups. Right, if you go with the default DAO standard, which is 100 gram microswitches and 100 gram springs, this is what they were using in the original DAO controllers, and a lot of people said that the DAOs needed a breaking in before they actually started to feel nice. And the reason for that is, obviously, you had 200 grams of resistance, which is okay. You know, as I said at the start, it's playable. It's not a problem, but what happens is you start to get tired around 11s and 12s, just because the keys are so stiff. I guess people said the keys were stiff, but it's just because there was so much resistance with both the microswitch and the spring. So people would wear it down by like leaving books on top of the controller for a bit, just to get the resistance down a little bit. So obviously, as I said, some arcades have used this, notably Hawaii was running this for a long time, and it is very heavy. It makes difficult stuff more difficult. I find that if you play on this, you get tired very quickly, and I wouldn't recommend it just because it is a little bit too heavy. Right, so let's move on to springless setups. Now, what I would recommend, if you do have 100 gram switches and you want a setup which is quite ideal, then I would say that springless 100 grams is completely viable. I've tested it out myself, and basically what happens is it's good, but it once again doesn't give you that cushioned feel when you push the button. What will happen is it will remove all of that extra spring resistance. It'll lie on that 100 gram switch, and it will just feel sort of like on and off. There's no in between. So when you hit it, obviously it gives a nice amount of resistance. It gives you 100 grams resistance, but it doesn't give you that cushion which comes with the springs. So what people have stated with this, notably players from Gemini, is that the feeling, you know, for really dense hard songs, like, you know, dense level 12s, is really good on this setup. But notably, jacks are more difficult, as I said before. If you remove that cushioned feedback feel, it makes doing jacks quite difficult. And I found this at Nova, where they've also got a setup like this with 100 gram springless, and yeah, it's okay, but jacks are more difficult on these setups. So I'd recommend it, but yeah, it's a bit difficult to do jacks. So moving on. The final setup which I'll explore is one which people have suggested and thought about, but I would not recommend in the slides. That is 50 gram switches and no springs. So what happens here is, because the 50 gram switches are so light, I don't think they actually offer enough feedback to lift the button properly. So what happens is the button sits on the switch and it's already like partially pressed down. So the feeling that you get from playing on this is basically like playing on a KOC, but it's kind of worse, to be honest. Like, you get absolutely no feedback. or resistance. So it just feels like you're tapping on a desk, like you're not actually pushing down buttons. So I would say for this setup, you'd want at least, if you want to go for a light setup, don't run no springless on 50 gram microswitches. At least use a 25 gram spring, because with zero feedback, 1, you risk damaging your switches, 2, you risk the button not even coming up, and 3, it feels like a JKOC. It sort of just removes the purpose of buying an ASC in the first place. So I would recommend steering away from this setup if you can. Like I'd honestly recommend just using a spring setup or springless 100 gram. Like this one you'd want to steer clear from. Okay, so let's just wrap things up. This is the picture that I posted in the American 2DX channel. This basically just shows how the feeling sort of is represented on a graph. Okay, so my recommendations would be the 50 gram and 100 gram springless. They give just the right amount of feedback and just the right amount of resistance. So highly recommend those two. 100 gram spring is viable, but it makes you very tired quickly. And finally, 50 gram springless, which you can't see because my head's in the way, is just not viable. Honestly, I don't think you can run 50 gram springless. You'd want to run at least 100 grams. So if you take away anything from this video, just make sure that you prioritize microswitches. Like, microswitches are the most important part of the setup. Which microswitches you use depends on the type of spring that you have. So whether if you have like heavy 100 gram ones or if you have 25 gram ones, you can work around it and you can sort of just mix and match to tailor. Aim for that sweet spot, that 100 to 150 gram sweet spot. And Sanwas are not necessary. Okay, like if you think I must have Sanwas to play my best, then you're wrong. No, they're just a luxury item. Yes, they're fantastic. I would highly recommend them, but they are not necessary for playing well. So yeah, Sanwas are great, but you don't need them. DAO keys are fine if you're just wanting something. If you're on a budget, definitely get the DAO keys. Okay. Now the last point I want to make, because when I showed this picture to the American 2DX channel, it blew up with people saying, "Oh my god, you know, I play on this setup and you know it's clearly better for me." That's the point. It's for you. You know, no one else is going to be playing on your setup. I mean, you know, you could show the arcade standard to thousands of people, but in the end, you know, there will be variance. There'll be differences. People will want something different. So in the arcades as well, you find that not all of the machines are the same. Some are running springless setups. Some are running really, really light setups, like the one I was mentioning before. It's all up to you. Like, play with what you find is comfortable, because at the end of the day, it's your controller. Like, no one can tell you what to do. All this video is trying to do is suggest to you the Japanese standard, so that you know you've got the information on, you know, what to do if you want to achieve an arcade-esque setup. So yeah, although I'm giving information here, it comes down to you. Like, you can just choose what you want to play on, because it's your controller. So that's it for me today. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe to my YouTube, or please follow me on Twitch. But that's it for the presentation, guys. Thank you very much for watching.